Tensions have been high between China and Japan since early November 2025 and going into December, after Japan's new Prime Minister, Sanaya Takaichi, made multiple headline statements that angered China. So why has the social-political relationship between China and Japan become so hostile, and why is there no signs of cooling down? To answer this question, we must first look into Sanaya Takaichi. Before taking office on October 21st, she served as the first female chairperson of the Liberal Democratic Party's Policy Research Council, a position that solidified her influence within the party under Shinzo Abe's aligned leadership. She described herself as Abe's disciple during her first attempt to lead the LDP in 2021. Just like Abe, she holds questionable views regarding Japan's history with China. Back in 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, then Prime Minister Tomoichi Murayama of the Social Democratic Party, the SDP, announced the Murayama Statement. It was the clearest and the most direct official apology of colonial rule and aggression of Imperial Japan. It was adopted by a cabinet decision which gives it the status of a formal government view intended to bind future cabinets to follow the statement. Unfortunately, Murayama passed away on the 17th of October at the age of 101. In 2005, the Koizumi statement from then Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi from the LDP reaffirmed the Murayama statement. However, the 2015 Abe statement was a bit controversial because it mentioned that those after the post-war generation should not be predestined to apologize. Back in 1994, Takaichi actually challenged Murayama directly in the National Diet over his future statement for potentially dishonoring Japanese soldiers. Besides the Murayama statement, Takaichi opposes the Kono statement, which acknowledges the notorious forced abduction of comfort women by the Imperial Japan military. Takaichi is also a prominent executive member of Nippon Kaigi, Japan's largest ultra-conservative and ultra-nationalist far-right lobbying group. It officially holds the view that the 300,000 Nanjing massacre death toll cited by China is either exaggerated or fabricated, and such anti-Japanese propaganda should be removed from Chinese schools' curricula. In fact, every prime minister since Shinzo Abe is or was a member of the Nippon Kaigi. You have heard me mention the LDP multiple times now. The Liberal Democratic Party is a right-wing nationalist party that formed in 1955 as a merger between the Liberal Party and Japan Democratic Party. Both conservative parties formed a united front against the then popular Japan Socialist Party, the JSP. The JSP served as the main opposition party to the conservative LDP for decades until its dissolution and conversion to the SDP in 1996. It continuously challenged conservative efforts to increase Japan's military capabilities and revise its pacifist foundations. The JSP also pressured Japan to switch diplomatic ties from the Republic of China to the People's Republic of China in the late 1970s. Since 1955, the LDP has been out of power in Japan for only approximately 4 years and 2 months. After taking office as Japan's first female prime minister, Takaichi attended a series of dire debates. And here enters the first controversial event, which happened on November 7th during a session of the Budget Committee in the House of Representatives, which is the lower house. Katsuya Okada, the opposition leader of the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan, the CDP, questioned Takaichi over a series of hypothetical scenarios, which is a common practice in the National Diet. He began with the following case. If the Bashi Channel between China and the Philippines was put under blockade, ships can still take a detour to reach Japan. Since Japan's energy or food supply will not be cut off, under what grounds would such a blockade become an existential crisis? Takaichi replied, if the US military is to deploy to defend Taiwan, and if China uses force to prevent it, then it could constitute an existential crisis. She said the government must determine if the event occurring at that moment constitutes an existential crisis by comprehensively judging all information regarding how the situation arose. Okada pointed out his concern that such an argument gives the government an extremely wide scope of discretion. He challenged that if Japanese ships have not been attacked and supplies have not been cut off, it is not an existential crisis. He criticized Takaichi for speaking lightly over such matters and referenced the suffering of the general population in Ukraine and Gaza. Okada then questioned whom this force is used against, implying that it should not be Japan's consideration when it is not being directly attacked. Later on, he suggested that if this situation occurs in the Korean peninsula, Japan should prioritize the evacuation and acceptance of refugees instead of the use of force. From 1972 up until 2014, the government's interpretation was that the right to collective self-defense, which implies deploying the Japan Self-Defense Force, the JSDF, to defend an ally, was prohibited by paragraph 2 of Article 9. In 2015, the administration of Shinzo Abe passed the Legislation for Peace and Security, which reinterpreted Japan's post-war pacifist constitution. Under the new legislation, the three new conditions were written into paragraph 4 of Article 2 of the Armed Attack Situation Response Law. For the JSDF to legally use force, all three conditions must be satisfied. The first condition is the one that we're going to focus on, the existential threat or survival-threatening situation, which is defined by when a foreign country with a close relationship to Japan or Japan itself suffers an armed attack that endangers Japan's existence and the fundamental rights to its populace, specifically their right to life, liberty, and well-being. Japanese mainstream media polls at the time showed 50 to 60% of respondents opposed the passage of the bills. After Abe resigned in 2020, he initiated official Japanese political discussion over the topic of a Taiwan contingency is a Japan contingency and a contingency for the US-Japan alliance, by voicing this exact opinion in 2022 publicly. Going back to current events, on November 8th, the Chinese Consul General in Osaka, Xue Jian, tweeted China's first official response on X. He responded to Japan's Asahi News post on Takaichi's existential threat statement by saying that that kind of filthy head that barges in without permission should be cut off without a moment's hesitation. Are you prepared? The tweet instantly triggered widespread media attention and angered a lot of Japanese people, as well as prompted immediate response from the Japanese government. Subsequently, both governments filed multiple protests to each other throughout the next 2 weeks. The Chinese government strongly condemned Takaichi's remarks as a gross interference in China's internal affairs and a breach of the One China principle, citing the 4 Sino-Japanese joint political documents. Beijing insists that Japan must reaffirm its commitment from the 1972 Sino-Japanese Joint Statement, which includes upholding Article 8 of the Potsdam Declaration and the return of Taiwan. China has explicitly threatened a head-on blow of military retaliation against Japan if it intervenes militarily over Taiwan. Then on the 18th of November, a meeting was held between the foreign affairs representatives from both sides, including Kanae Masaki from the Japanese side and Liu Jingshong from the Chinese side. Press videos taken while both were leaving from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China show Liu speaking to Masaki with hands in his pocket, while Masaki kept his head down. The interaction sparked widespread dissatisfaction from Japanese netizens, calling Liu out for being rude and Masaki for his weak posture. As part of its retaliatory measures, China issued multiple economic sanctions. On November 15th, China issued travel warnings to Japan citing safety reasons, which was followed by the cancellation of flights by China's 3 main airlines. This response was used in 2016 over the THAAD anti-ballistic missile defense system deployment in South Korea. The number of Chinese tourists plummeted from 8.06 million in 2016 to 4.17 million in 2017, a decrease of 48.3% in a single year. The postponed release of Japanese films in Chinese theaters were mirrored by the boycott of K-dramas and K-pop concerts back then. China rebanned the import of Japanese seafoods, which was originally banned due to the release of wastewater into the ocean from the Fukushima power plant. Talks on fully resuming beef import, which was initially banned due to the mad cow disease outbreak in 2001, have also been suspended. Later on the 24th, China rejected proposal from Japan for a trilateral summit with Korea in January. On the 16th of November, a China Coast Guard formation passed through the waters surrounding the disputed Diaoyu Dao, or the Senkaku Islands. However, this is a regular occurrence and not necessarily a targeted response. From mid-November to early December, the PLA executed 3 rounds of live-firing exercises in the Yellow Sea, one of which lasted for 2 weeks. On November 26, Takaichi was questioned by Yoshihiko Noda, the leader of the CDP, during a diet debate. Yoshihiko wanted her to retract the November 7th statement to repair economic damage caused by China's tourism warnings. Takaichi in turn argued that since Japan renounced its claim of Taiwan in the 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty, the SFPT, without specifying to whom Taiwan was returned to, Japan is not in a position to determine or recognize the island's current legal status. Or, in other words, she argued that Japan is not legally bound to recognize the PRC's sovereignty over the island. However, neither did the PRC partake in the signing of the SFPT, nor does it consider the treaty legal. The Sino-Japanese joint statement has always been the standing bilateral agreement on the Taiwan problem since 1972. It's not just China that Takaichi angered. South Korea also has beef with Japan now. While relations are warming with China after South Korea's new president, Lee Jae-myung, met Xi Jinping, the same cannot be said between South Korea and Japan. Takaichi also triggered the Koreans by claiming the South Korean-controlled disputed island of Dokdo or the Liancourts Rocks as Japanese. Some Koreans compare Takaichi to South Korea's unpopular ex-president Yoon Suk-yeol, who attempted a coup. In response, the ROK Navy postponed a joint exercise with the JMSDF scheduled for late November. Korean news media also hinted that China is trying to rally South Korean support with the recognition of Dokdo as Korean territory, but a lot of Koreans are not buying it either because of active disputes in the Yellow Sea, or known as West Sea to the Koreans. While Japan has been acting strong, the White House was initially noticeably quiet, suggesting the US was deliberately avoiding an open endorsement of Takaichi. When asked about the current situation, Trump downplayed the China threat by saying, "Our allies have taken advantage of us in trade more than China has." A US Typhoon missile system that was temporarily deployed to Iwakuni Base for the Resolute Dragon 2025 joint exercise since September has been removed, confirmed by Japan's Defense Ministry on the 10th of November. However, another system deployed last year to the northern Philippines and positioned to cover the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea for a joint exercise remains there. The most important sign of US reluctance is the phone call between Trump and Takaichi that occurred after the phone conversation between Xi and Trump. Trump advised Takaichi to dial down the volume on her expression over the Taiwan problem to avoid further infuriating Beijing. He stressed the importance of stable ties between Japan and China, emphasizing that he did not want any escalations to disrupt US-China interactions. In contrast, Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te of the TPP jumped out with a video telling people that now is a good time to eat sushi, a not-so-subtle display of support for Takaichi. His behavior led to very divided opinions and intense debate among Taiwan's population. I will cover the ongoing remilitarization of Japan in my next video, but the takeaway is, as Japan and Taiwan rush to militarize themselves, the golden window of opportunity for the PRC to solve the Taiwan problem could be shrinking by the day. This window is defined by a period where the cost of a forced reunification by military action is minimal. If going to war with Japan could solve the Taiwan problem, it would simplify matters considerably for China. The focus of concern would transition from the potential harm of Chinese population residing on the island to restraining a century's worth of outrage against Japan that is infused in the blood of the Chinese people. In addition, a lot of Chinese believe that China will not enjoy prolonged peace should Japan be left unchecked while it continues to develop along its current trajectory. On November 21st, 2 weeks after Takaichi made her initial statement, China's permanent representative to the UN, Fu Chong, submitted a letter to the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. The letter asserted that, since Japan's threat to intervene militarily over Taiwan constitutes a severe infringement on China's sovereignty and a direct challenge to the post-war international order, China would invoke the enemy state clauses against Japan. The clause is based on UN Charter's Article 53 and 107 for post-war transitional arrangement, which grants the victorious Allied powers in the Permanent Security Council the right to take enforcement actions against former Axis states should they renew aggressive policies, and without authorization by the UN Security Council. In line with Article 51's provision for the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense, this clause establishes the legal foundation for China to initiate a counterattack. And for various historical reasons, the definition for the end of the transitional period remains ambiguous. Although the enemy state clause has been considered obsolete by some, including Japanese politicians, the barrier for amending the UN Charter is extremely high, requiring ratification by 2/3 of the UN member states, including all the permanent members of the Security Council. China essentially has the power to veto any attempt to amend the clause. During a Diet session in March 2023, Taro Yamamoto already warned that aggressive remilitarization could give other permanent UNSC members a legal pretext to invoke these clauses against Japan. In regards to the US legal position on this issue, the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security between the US and Japan clearly establishes that the parties' rights and obligations under the UN remain unaffected by the terms of the treaty. This provides a legal foundation that would allow the US to choose not to defend Japan. At the end of the day, however, international treaties are always subject to varying interpretation by different parties. Besides the UN Charter, China is also bringing more local and global attention to the issue of Ryukyu independence, which stems from the historical independent Ryukyu Kingdom. On the legal side of things, the islands are subject to Allied determination under the Potsdam Declaration. The PRC rejected the confirmation of Japan's residual sovereignty over the islands under the SFPT. From Beijing's perspective, it still holds the right to determine the fate of the Ryukyu Islands, and Chinese people generally feel responsible for the protection of the Ryukyu people. As tension builds up between Beijing and Tokyo, we should expect to see more Chinese advances on the political and cultural front on this matter. China seems to be learning from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where Russia failed to adequately prepare international public opinion before launching its military operation. Through its letter to the UN, it is establishing that any further military action against Japan is in accordance with international order and does not warrant any sanctions or retaliatory actions from Japan's allies. Another possible flashpoint is over the disputed Diaoyu Dao, or the Senkaku Islands. Japan's position over the islands is that it was never part of the territory ceded by China in 1895 as a result of the First Sino-Japanese War and the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Japan claims that the islands were formally incorporated as terra nullius, which means land belonging to no one, into Okinawa Prefecture in 1895 prior to the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Therefore, when Japan renounced Taiwan in the 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty, the SFPT, and the 1952 Treaty of Taipei, the Senkaku Islands were left untouched as Japanese territory. However, once again, the PRC considers the SFPT illegal, and the Treaty of Taipei was nullified under the 1972 joint statement. From the PRC's perspective, Diaoyu Dao was returned to China as a part of Taiwan under the Potsdam Declaration, which excluded the island from Japanese sovereignty. So, who has come out on top of this diplomatic clash between the two largest economies of Asia? On December 3rd, during a lower house Diet session, Shinji Takaichi of the Komeito stated that the Japanese tourism industry has been hit hard and questioned Takaichi whether Japan's position on Taiwan remains adhered to the 1972 Sino-Japanese joint statement. Stocks of Japanese retail and tourism companies like the department store chain Mitsukoshi and Japan Airlines have dropped 5 to 10%. Japan's tourism industry faces grave risk of loss in billions of dollars as Chinese tourists form a significant proportion of revenue source. Takaichi responded to the question by confirming Japan's compliance with the joint statement. Beijing successfully presented the Japanese government a ladder to take one step down from the current position without the risk of facing heavy backlash from its population for bowing down to China. At the same time, it achieved a political and diplomatic victory as Japan effectively reiterated its recognition of the One China policy. However, Takaichi has yet to answer Beijing's demand for the retraction of the initial existential crisis statement. There is no reason to believe that the LDP-led government of Japan will not revive its hawkish stance towards China in the near future, since almost half of its population is supportive of such actions. A Kyodo News survey from the 17th of November found that 48.8% of Japanese were in favor of exercising collective self-defense in the case of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, while 44.2% were against it. In a separate question, 60.4% of Japanese people backed Takaichi's plan to accelerate the increase in defense spending. Japan should also expect more severe and swift retaliation from the Chinese government should it repeat such stunts. Besides, compared to the Japanese government, the Chinese central government receives full support on this matter from its population. The Chinese people are no stranger to Takaichi's language, which was repeated by Imperial Japan as justification for the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894, invasion of Manchuria in 1931, and the full-scale invasion of China in 1937. They have yet to write off the blood debt of Japan from the crimes against humanity committed throughout these wars. If anyone would be on the receiving end of this generational hatred, it would be none other than Takaichi herself. Both of her personal and government car license plate numbers match the date of the Marco Polo Bridge incident, which is 1937, July the 7th. This kind of behavior is simply outrageous in the eyes of many Chinese people, especially when it comes from the head of state of Japan, or so it may seem. There is, however, evidence that suggests an alternative case. The application for the Asuka regional number plate shown on the car only began in 2020. Since the car was likely re-registered during its restoration around 2024, the number plate was almost certainly issued at that time, supporting the theory that the number was chosen by combining her birthday on March the 7th and her husband's on July the 7th to honor the reunion. Besides, the number plate clearly says Expo 2025. Nonetheless, this case offers an insight into the general sentiment of the Chinese people regarding Takaichi. According to some members of the LDP, Takaichi intends to make a surprise visit to the Yasukuni Shrine, and this date could possibly be the 26th of December, which matches Abe's date of visit in 2013. The shrine commemorates numerous Class A Japanese war criminals from World War II and others from the First Sino-Japanese War. How can we expect the Chinese people to forgive Japan when there are Japanese politicians like Shinzo Abe who seem totally unapologetic from their contradictory actions? If the visit goes ahead as planned, it will be a clear sign that the Japanese government does not intend to back down from its hawkish stance, and will spark further outrage from the Chinese government and society. Clearly, restoring friendly relations between China and Japan will not be an easy task, and we shall anticipate to see some long-term sour relations between the two countries. I would like to take the time to ask you guys for words of suggestion so that I can improve my next video. This is my first English video on YouTube. I want to know whether you prefer my previous or my current tone. Stay tuned for my next video on the remilitarization of Japan. If you enjoyed today's content, please like and subscribe. You can also support me through PayPal, link is in the description below.